In my experience, baking AO tends to be more forgiving, since it doesn't really have to take into account the normals other than the general facing of the polygons. However, the bake times themselves can take longer, which is why I prefer to use something like XNormal instead of Maya. It's just quite a bit quicker. In this example, I'm going to be baking this piece on her back here. Well, I don't really know what it is, but it's a ring with some skulls, and I thought it would be kind of a cool thing. So in XNormal here, I assume most of you have had some experience using XNormal, so I won't go into a lot of the minutiae of the of what things are and how to render. Instead, I'll just kind of hit upon some of the things that I might do a little bit differently. If you haven't used XNormal before, then I highly recommend you check out xnormal.net, the website, because there are already a lot of resources, and they're all free, about how to use this program. So what I do differently here, or some things that I would like to just call out, is the default mesh scale down at the bottom here. By default it's 1, but if you get some errors in XNormal saying that things are too small, and you might get some errors, then you might want to try increasing this. When you change this number, in this case I changed it to 10, then any mesh that you bring in subsequently will come in at 10 under mesh scale. But you can also change this per object, so this just changes things when it gets brought in, and this happens for both low and high. You can see the low definition meshes has the default mesh scale down there. In this case, I would just check on these two meshes. These are my high resolution meshes, which is made of the ring itself and also the skulls. And for the low, I just have one object, which is the object that you see highlighted back there. I'm not going to change any of the other settings right now because I don't really need to. But I did find numbers that already worked for me here, the maximum frontal and rear ray distance. If you remember back when I was rendering in Maya, and that red envelope that changed with when I changed the values, this is something pretty similar, and I'm sure XNormal has its own way of calculating things, but I kind of like to think of them as the same thing. So you're just pushing out how far away you want the distance to be, and also how far in. I've already found some numbers that work, so I'm just going to go with these, and we'll talk more about this kind of thing a little bit later. Under baking options, pretty standard stuff. Again, I use 0 edge padding because I add that myself later, but you can do whatever you want. For these two here are checked by default. Sometimes I will uncheck this closest hit if ray fails. This kind of has to do a lot with if your high resolution mesh is quite a bit smaller than your low here. For example, if it was a lot thinner than the low resolution mesh and you baked it, you might get some miscast rays along the edges here. And so if you have any problems with that, then I would check this or uncheck it, depending on what you're looking for. I stick with the default bucket render personally. The CUDA render is a lot faster, but I kind of like the results of the default more. And anti-aliasing, I'll keep it at 1x right now. It's just adding it, giving more, makes a nicer, smoother result, but it adds quite a bit to render time. And here, maps to render, just remember that there is a slider here, so there are a lot more maps to render. I remember for a long time I didn't notice this slider. And for ambient occlusion, that's what I have checked here, so that's what we'll render. If you take a look at these settings, let's go back to defaults. Razors, general, quality. I stick with uniform for the distribution. Cosine and cosine SQ, which I assume means cosine squared maybe. But I stick to uniform because I want as much spread in the shadowing as possible. I know that's not what everyone wants, but in my case, that's what I'm looking for. I'll just increase these rays to something quite a bit higher for a smoother result. And I don't mess with the occluded color, unoccluded color. And these settings in here, bias, spread angle, limit ray distance, and attenuation, these all affect how the shadowing spreads in the AO map. I put together this scene here to try to give visual examples of what some of these settings do in XNormal. Now, a lot of this looks pretty similar right here because I have the normal map on, but if I turned it off just so that only the texture shows, you can see the difference. If we go back to XNormal just for a second, just to bring this up again, you see here, let's see, for the bias, the default is 0.08. Now if you look here, I have, if I max it out at 1, this is the result, and then this is with it at 0. You can see when it's higher, that one reason why I would avoid making it too high is because you kind of get this little groove in here, like it kind of highlights that groove in there, and I don't like that effect on my bigs. But if you go too low, it's smooth in there, which I do like. But if you go too low, like at 0, then you can it starts picking up the tessellation of the high-res surface that it's sampling from. So I don't have a number that I stick with all the time for bias. It kind of depends on the situation and what I have going on. So I guess I do go a little bit lower than default. The default is 0.08 as a starting point. Maybe I'll try 0.01 or a little bit lower than that. Now for limit ray distance, this is what happens. It kind of concentrates the shadowing, and that's kind of the effect that I don't like. So I never have that checked on. And these both were rendered with uniform distribution, and these are with cosine and cosine SQ. The difference you can see as you go to from cosine to cosine SQ, the shadowing gets more, it gets pulled in. The spread isn't as far, and this kind of depends on what you are going for, what kind of result that you like. I personally, as I said before, I like having a lot of spread on the shadowing. And for the angle here, you can see this is the default. Compare that with here on the max angle. If I max out the angle, which I believe is 179.5, something like that, versus the default, which is 162, I think, you can see that on the surface here, some of the detail gets lost compared to if you max it out. But this kind of depends on, again, what you are going for. I like to have as much detail showing through on the ambient occlusion as possible, but some people don't like that. Some people would rather it be only limited to areas that are truly being occluded. And for the three examples up here, you can see the difference where I have, this is rendered by default, just the high res ring and skulls and the low res. And then for this one, I call this a directional AO effect. And the way I get this is by adding a floor. If you go back to X normal here, and go back to high definition meshes, I have a ground plane added here. And if I check that on and I rendered it, then I get this kind of effect. So, I mean, that's kind of essentially the same thing as just adding a floor underneath your objects like this. I just make it really big and have it somewhere below the surface of the object. And I try not to have it be too close, or else it gets super dark there. But as long as it doesn't intersect. So what this does is it will kind of limit the light that's coming from the bottom to kind of simulate a lighting effect where the light is coming mostly from overhead and a little bit less on the sides. Now, this isn't desirable for a lot of people because, generally speaking, on AO you don't want to have very specific lighting, because the thing about the strength of using a normal map driven workflow is that you can have a surface that reacts to the light in a convincing way. So when the light changes, everything looks right in most lighting situations. And in a case like this, if you have a directional lighting baked in like this strongly, then that illusion kind of breaks. So if the dynamic light in the game swung to the bottom and shown up, then you would still have some lighting on the top too. And there are times when that can lead to some visually jarring results. However, there are some game engines that don't have a really nice lighting engine, but they still use normal maps. And in that situation, I do use a bit of this directional AO. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll add these together. Like I'll bake one normally, and I'll bake one with directional. And this is kind of it with the directional 50% opacity on top of this max angle. I mean, I had to edit it a little bit, but you can see this is the result that I actually like a lot, because you can see all the detail on it. I mean, it gets a little bit more light on the top, but that's not a huge deal considering we are also living with the shadows on the inside. So what I like to do with this is use it as a starting point for my diffuse texture. Now, a lot of people, what they'll do is they will have an AO kind of like this, and then they'll just keep it on a multiply layer on top of their texture just to kind of give it some shadowing. And that's fine, but that's not really the way I like to work. I think that's kind of a solution that doesn't always give me the result that I'm looking for in a texture. I mean, I will have this lying around, so if I do need that texture separately for some reason, then I can always fall back on it. But I like to start with something like this, and I'll show you how I use something like this in the next volume. In my opinion, it's not really critical for an AO bake result to be perfect, because it's way easier to paint out mistakes on an AO map compared to painting things out on a normal map. I rarely use AO as is straight out of the bake, and this is kind of what I consider to be straight out of the bake. I always do something kind of like this, or you'll see in the next volume how I will hand paint in more areas to be lighter or darker, just to kind of push and pull where I want viewers to be looking at more. It kind of like just getting a head start on establishing the values of the map of the model. AO is one of those things that I think I use differently from other artists. I think most artists prefer to reserve the darkest areas to the most extreme recesses. But for the reasons I just mentioned, I will do whatever looks the best in the game engine. And I've worked in some game engines where having more directional lighting makes it look better, and in some engines, sort of like Marmoset Toolbag, where you really don't need that. In fact, this can kind of cause too much visual fighting, and it can be a little bit little jarring to the eye. But it's up to you and what you're really looking for.